Hi, I'm Janet Gross. Welcome to Coping Today, a place where we talk about mental health and well-being. And today we want to talk about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. In the past, it's been called a soldier's heart, shell shock, battle fatigue, but we know it's more than war-related. Natural disasters, physical assault, even witnessing somebody else's trauma can trigger this. And Dr. Roy Salgado, professor of counseling at the University of Holy Cross, joins us to talk this out, the disorder's trauma and the treatment.
Yes.
Because there is treatment.
There is treatment, yes. And a number of individuals find themselves with the symptoms of PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. And we talk about trauma today in a way that we hadn't talked about it before. And we talk about trauma with a little t and trauma with a big T. And there are things that are traumatic that impact an individual in a certain way that perhaps it doesn't impact another person. So oftentimes you could have the same event, the same experience happen to two different individuals. One person be impacted by it in a way that they, in time, experience the symptoms associated with PTSD and another person not. And so it's important to know that people can experience traumatic events in different ways. I equate it to perhaps a person hears a joke, and then the joke could be highly disturbing or offensive to one person, another person could laugh at it. Not to say that events could be treated that way, but people are impacted by things differently. We're all different, and so it's important to know and not dismiss, and I say that to not dismiss events and say, oh, well, that's not a big deal. A person could find themselves being traumatized by an event and then experience the symptoms associated with the disorder that accompanies it, as someone else would not. Like a person could hear a joke and not be impacted by it, but another person could hear a joke and be disturbed and offended by it. And so people are going to respond to similar circumstances in varying ways. And so it's important that we're mindful of things that could potentially impact someone and have a traumatic impact or effect on them.
And it's not that it's prevalent, but it happens often enough to people. I mean, we have a month, a PTSD awareness month, June.
Yes.
And I mean, it does happen to a lot of people. And
as you
might
said,
be suppressed, you know what I'm saying?
Yes, and as you said, it was identified decades ago in soldiers. You know, we used to refer to it as shell shock, and so individuals would come back from battle or from combat and experience the symptoms associated with PTSD. But over time, we have found that people experience those symptoms with regard to a number of different events, life-threatening events, such as assault, rape, robbery, hurricanes, earthquakes, terrorist attacks, a number of carjackings, a number of different life-threatening events that elicit that response in a person that feels like their life is about to come to an end. And then even when the threat has surpassed and it's no longer there, the symptoms associated with that repeated stressor of feeling that there's an impending doom, that threat is around the corner still, reliving it in the moment as if it had something happened some time ago, as if it's happening in the moment.
That's what I was going to ask. It brings them back to what the original thing was, right?
Yes. You know, when we think about a bad experience, I may think about a bad experience, and it's simply that. It's nothing more than a memory or a thought. Post-traumatic stress disorder, the individual is experiencing the events of the past, the traumatic, life-threatening event of the past, that lived experience, in a very visceral manner in the present moment, as if it's happening again oftentimes. That rape, that carjacking, that physical assault, that combat moment, those things are being experienced by the body and remembered by the individual. The body keeps score. It's being remembered in the moment and being relived to a certain extent in the mind as it had in the moment that it actually took place.
So you're actually like kind of seeing it, imagining, or your heart, all those different functions in you are
yes, they're all heightened and they're all responding in the moment as if it's happening again. That flashback, if you will, that is referred to, often associated with PTSD.
Do people realize this is happening to them and that it's out of the ordinary, that this is not just a regular memory, it's something else?
At times, it's so instantaneous, it's kind of hard to tease out that it's, the body is just reacting in that moment. The body is just, in that fight or flight response, in that perceived threat mode. And so in the moment, an individual may not necessarily be aware that they're not in imminent danger. Their body and their mind is experiencing their current thought, that memory, as if they're in imminent danger. There's something that may have triggered it, perhaps a sight, a sound, a smell, something that kind of brought that back, that's in the recesses of their mind, that makes their whole organism relive the moment as if it's happening again.
Is this something that, I mean, obviously can be treated? Is it a long I mean, how do you address something like that where, you know, your body is taken over, your brain is taken over, and say you're there, you know?
It is a challenge. It is a challenge, but there are treatments available to individuals to be able to mitigate the symptoms of PTSD and become something that is manageable for many, and for others, perhaps something that they can overcome in time.
Okay. You know, before we're going to talk to a PTSD expert coming up, but before we go to the break, the University of Holy Cross is offering for right now some free counseling to help people with many things,
Yes.
not just PTSD, but other things.
Yes.
And tell us about that.
The Maronites of Holy Cross for several years now have been offering free telemental health counseling services to any resident in the state of Louisiana. So if there's an individual who is struggling with PTSD or any other diagnoses of some sort of any other symptomology associated with mental health issues, they can simply call the number on the screen, and the administrative assistant will take that call, triage it to the clinical director, and the clinical director will assign it to a counselor in training, and you will receive services free of charge throughout the duration of your diagnoses and the help that they do through telemental health.
Man, that's such a great gift, really.
It truly is. It's a wonderful mission that the Maronites have been able to offer to the residents of Louisiana.
And it started at the beginning of COVID, and you know, at least for right now, they've kept it going.
Yes, yes, they've kept it going for the foreseeable future.
Okay. All right, well, we're going to take a break. When we come back, we'll talk about the diagnosis and development of PTSD, so stay with us.
Can I tell you a cat joke? Just kidding.
And welcome back. We're joined now as we talk about PTSD by Gus White, counselor, therapist, and PTSD expert. Thanks for joining us, Gus.
Thank you.
Well, okay, let's first start. Who develops PTSD? I mean, is there a category? Is it just anybody could have this?
Anyone at any time is acceptable to develop PTSD. The National Center for PTSD is a program in the Veterans Affairs state that 7 or 8 people out of 100 are able or will develop PTSD. Women are more susceptible and more likely to experience PTSD than men.
Wow, that's interesting. So, I mean, that's a huge percentage. 8% of
8%
people,
is
that's a lot
significant.
of people. And that's, I mean, is it a one-time thing? Is it a ongoing? Gus?
As far as being ongoing, I mean, the symptoms will continue until the individual is able to learn some new coping strategies in order to deal with what they're experiencing. Can it become worse? It can be completely debilitating. And it can be managed over time. And that management I'm going to suggest would be with therapy.
Okay, so this is something you may not just be able to get over, because obviously there's a lot of work in there that you just can't get over it by yourself.
There are some who do not work on themselves. Can PTSD be managed? Yes. I'm of the opinion that it never goes away. It's sort of like having a Phillips screwdriver for the last 50 years, and you've used it every day. Now, there's a good chance that tool is going to be stripped. You need to refurbish the tools. There are times that you have to buy new ones. And that's the same way with coping strategies. A coping strategy is a tool.
You know, and to that point of it never going away, when someone has experienced at some point in their life a threatening event, they in that moment perceived their life about to come to an end, that leaves such an indelible mark on the individual, and it sits with them. They can manage it through therapy, they can overcome with the symptoms, they can do the work, but there's nothing to say that there's some other trigger in the future, something that's seen, something that's heard, something that's smelt, something that's tasted, something that's touched, that comes in through the senses that triggers or activates that response again. It's not anything for which you can plan. You can't plan to be triggered necessarily by certain things. You know, if you can mitigate and avoid certain circumstances while you're managing your symptoms, you know, you've experienced a certain event, then you know perhaps to avoid certain situations so that you don't find yourself being activated or triggered over and over again. But then you can't always account for absolutely everything. You can't plan for everything. So you might find yourself, even under the best of circumstances, where you're managing your care, that something triggers you and you're experiencing the symptoms of PTSD, that screwdriver being stripped, if you will.
Mm-hmm. So it really, it can be a sound or a smell, like you said, a smell, and you can't control that. You know, a big boom or a lightning or thunder, you know, those kinds of things. That's that's a scary thing.
You know, I think of a barbecue smell. When I smell someone grilling outside, I have pleasant memories of a very wonderful childhood memory that just always comes back. The same thing happens with negative and life-threatening events. You have a smell, and if it's associated with that,
you don't like that.
You don't like that, and it can really trigger you and bring those symptoms of PTSD about.
Okay, so do we know why it hits some people and some not, Gus? Can you talk about that? Or even or how to prevent it from happening to you? Maybe that's a better question.
To prevent it, it would be a matter of assessing your risk factors and if you should notice that you're having some problems, to seek help. How can I prevent walking down the street and having a serious accident happen in front of me? How can I prevent Katrina? Well, I prevented Katrina by exiting the city. Then we have people who can't do that. So sometimes it's within our realm of management, and sometimes it isn't. It also depends on an individual and their jobs. A person who would be an EMT, a fireman, a policeman, someone working in ER, a nurse or a doctor, and we've certainly seen those reports in the near past here.
You know, and to that extent of the preventative nature, you know, what is referred to as vicarious traumatization among varied professionals, you know, the firefighters, the police officers, medical personnel, including counselors. Counselors, we often hear of traumatic, awful situations day in and day out. We hear, unfortunately, at times, the worst of the worst that humanity can offer. And so there's that vicarious traumatization. I myself have specialized in working with survivors of sexual trauma. So I hear stories of sexual trauma, domestic violence, stalking, human trafficking. I have this in my mind. I haven't lived it personally, but I have heard enough of other people's lived experiences that now, as a preventative measure, I respond to my world and my environment differently so as to mitigate perhaps having certain things happen to my loved ones. Maybe I won't do certain things because I have heard of this being a thing that is possible. And so there are certain things that perhaps we can do to mitigate, but then as Mr. White said, there are other things that we just can't plan for. We can't plan for that car accident. We can't plan for that event that can just come about on any given moment.
That sounds like, for this particular disorder, it would be hard to be in one of those front lines and have that always, maybe, I'm saying that would be a difficult, I don't know,
It truly is, because there are certain
things
things you can plan for, and so to the extent that we can plan for things, perhaps things that we have learned throughout history, and because this tends to happen in these circumstances, so we're going to put these measures in place to keep that at bay. Mm-hmm. But then again, we can't plan for absolutely everything. There are things that just we can't think of or perceive to happen. And when that happens, unfortunately, the potential response to that is a PTSD type of response.
What do you do? How do you fix, isn't that a bad word? How do you treat that? How can you change the I don't know, your reaction? Just like you said, it's out of the blue. How do you change how it would feel? What is the process?
Well, cognitive behavioral therapy is often very helpful, but there's also other interventions. There's a 30-year-old treatment that's been in existence for, it's relatively new, 30 years new, EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing, which is a very skilled intervention that credentialed and highly trained mental health providers can offer to help individuals perhaps overcome trauma.
Okay. Gus, I know that you've seen a lot of this. How do you help someone with this?
Well, there are various interventions and techniques that counselors have, psychotherapists have. As Dr. Delgado was mentioning about EMDR, there's EMDR, there's different desensitizations, relaxation responses. And I want to go back to the individual's coping strategies. You take the policeman, you take the person in ER. There are these steps that they take that are traumatic, and they're able to cope with them, and then their coping strategies begin to get very, very thin. I refer to this as their approach to the threshold of PTSD. Are they able to come back a little bit? Yes. They might find listening to music. They might find being with their family. But then we also know that as PTSD is coming on, as we are exposed to those events, we tend to push our loved ones away, which makes it very hard for them to help. And there's sometimes that the loved one, the co-worker is able to see that there's some deterioration with the person, that they're getting further away. So if I say it's difficult, it's going to depend on the client, what the client wants to go ahead and do, and what works for them. Okay. I don't know if that made sense.
It does. I mean, it's obviously it's an individual approach.
Absolutely.
It has to be to match up. All right, Gus, thank you so much, Gus White, for walking through this with us and for helping us and for your advice. We appreciate it. We'll be back in a minute. Stay with us.
Louisiana needs a hero.
Someone to look after it, preserve it.
We have to do something now.
If everybody took care of their spot, we wouldn't have this conversation.
We all have to do our part.
The power is yours. All you have to do is pick it up.
Care about it. Protect it. Save it.
Be an everyday hero.
Keep Louisiana beautiful.
And we're back talking about dealing with PTSD. Our minds and bodies work together, and it's a complex miracle. And we see strength and limitations. But with PTSD, something's going wrong, and it's hard to address.
Yes.
Maybe not address, but sometimes it's hard to live through and then keep living through.
It's complex and it's compounded by a number of factors, and so that's why it makes it a little more challenging to address. But nevertheless, something that is manageable if dealt with properly and with the right skills. A person who experiences a traumatic event, something that feels like it's going to kill you in the moment, because that's typically what the response is you feel like your life is going to come to an end, whether it's a rape, an assault, war, natural disaster, fire, whatever. It feels like, could this be my last moment? And so then the body responds to that, and there's so much going on. There's things going in through all of our senses, and then the brain is releasing cortisol that just floods the body. So all these things are happening neurochemically all at once, not allowing the person to necessarily process what's happening. The person is just responding to the stimuli. And then they could be going through it all, and then the dust settles, and now they're left with what's left. And then maybe a week later, a month later, several years later, maybe even decades later, there are things that trigger, that can kind of stir things up in the individual that would meet the criteria for PTSD.
Wow. That's got to be a scary moment, not only the first time, but the second time.
Yes.
To feel that. And no one is immune, so it can happen to anybody.
No one is immune.
It's not like I can't face my death with courage,
right,
or the prospect of something horrible happening with courage. It's not that at all.
Right. It's not that at all. It's the body responding to a very real threat. And so you could have the most courageous person that in a typical circumstance they would not necessarily feel fear. But in the moment of a life or death situation where something is unexpected and it just kind of blindsides you and you see your life flash before you, that's a very impactful event in a person's life. Let's take a car accident, for example. A person might get into a car accident, and in that moment, it's a life-threatening situation, depending on how severe it is. Mm-hmm. And then the next time that they drive, they might be gun shy. Or the next time that, even if they're not a driver, but they were in a car accident, they were a passenger, the next time they're in a car, they're apprehensive, they're bracing themselves, they're braking, they're experiencing the symptoms of this apprehensive expectation of it happening again, because all of the signals are there of what happened, what was there before. The car itself, the motion, everything. So things are coming through the senses, and the body's trying to keep itself from being threatened again. Ideally, over time, it dissipates. So after about 30 days or so, people typically forget or overcome. They see, okay, that was a life-threatening event at that instance, but then it doesn't mean each and every single time that I am experiencing these triggers that it's going to be life-threatening. It turns out not to be, so it subsides. And that's what would be referred to as acute stress disorder, where it just lasts for a determined period of time, about 30 days. If it persists beyond that, and it starts to impact and impede life in a number of different domains, work, academics, social, family relations, then an individual would have a diagnosis of PTSD.
Okay. We actually have a viewer question that we wanted to put this up, and William, if you could do that, thanks. Okay, this viewer asks, what can be considered a trauma, and how do I know if I've been traumatized? I'm going to add to that question. Do you have to be the focus of it? Can you just be watching something horrible happen, and that affects you?
Yeah, in terms of the first part, what can be considered a trauma? Earlier in the episode, I talked about trauma with a small t and trauma with a big T, capital T. And so trauma with a small t, like I had said earlier, maybe it's not traumatic for someone else, but it could be traumatic for the individual. So anybody could be the survivor of a traumatic event. A car accident might be a traumatic event for an individual and it not really impact another person. They were both in a car accident. One person is traumatized and impacted by it and can develop PTSD as a result, and another person is able to overcome it relatively quickly and move forward. And so that's that part. The second part of the question is, can you repeat the second part of the question? I actually forgot the second question. How do I know that I have been traumatized? And that's how one could, if their life is impacted later on in life, in the weeks to come, and they are apprehensive, and they are gun shy, and they are startled, they have a quick startle response, or they have flashbacks, and their memory is more than just a memory. It's not just something that they're recalling, but there's a visceral feeling and response linked to the memory and what's being recalled. Those are things that could be indicators that you might be someone who is struggling with PTSD.
Do you maybe want to run? Is that
right.
part of it?
And people flee a situation. If they're overwhelmed by these emotions and they're in a room, for example, then they might want to get out. Or if they're in a car and they feel like, it's like, get me out, I just want to get out. They're looking for an escape hatch if they're feeling threatened. And so if you see that type of response in someone, they may be responding to some early adverse experience or life-threatening experience that they are recalling with their whole being in that moment.
We're about out of time, but I know you have tips for us.
Yes, we have several different tips as we normally do. And so if you are struggling with PTSD, talk with your healthcare provider. They often can do an initial assessment or screening to see if you meet the criteria. Engage in exercise. The physical movement of the body is something that's very helpful with managing a lot of the symptoms of PTSD. Practicing mindfulness, prayer, and meditation can be of help. Maintain routines with meals, exercise, and sleep. Set realistic goals, baby steps, day in and day out. Spend time with trusted friends or relatives. It's important to have a support system to get you through these difficult moments. Expect to improve gradually, but not immediately. Again, it's one day at a time. And to the extent that you can, avoid alcohol and drugs, because substances such as alcohol and drugs do not help when trying to overcome a diagnosis like PTSD.
Okay, and just in future, thank you for the question, whoever gave that question, but we have a place you can ask questions, and it's copingtoday@WLAE.com. So just send us your questions there for this. Something that you would like to know, we can put them in the shows as we go.
Wonderful.
Right. And thank you, Roy, and Dr. Roy Salgado, for talking this all through with PTSD. And of course, we thank all of your colleagues at the University of Holy Cross for helping us. And thank you for watching and being a part of Coping Today.